what is racism? How much of it is in our world today? If we were thinking about this activity of Hitler spotting, how and trying to steelman the case of, if not critical race theory, but people who look for racism in our world, how much would you say?
Well, it's a good thing to try to define. I would say that racism is the belief that other people are inferior to you. You could see a form of it where you thought people were superior to you. That could also happen, but more commonly, it's you see a group of people as being inferior to you simply by dint of the fact that they have a different racial background, and that's sort of the easiest way to define racism. As I say, I mean, there are types of racism. I mean, mainly anti-Semitism, actually. Perhaps it's the only one, which weirdly relies on a hatred of people who a certain type of person thinks are better than them. And that's a particular peculiarity, one of the peculiarities of anti-Semitism.
Well, anti-Semitism somehow does both, right?
Yes. Well, one of the eternal fascinating things about anti-Semitism is it does everything at the same time.
It's like a quantum racism.
Yes.
You're both superior and inferior.
You know that, do you know Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate? So in the middle of Life and Fate, which a Persian friend of mine always said was one of only two great novels of the 20th century. She was a very harsh literary critic.
What was the other one?
Oh, The Leopard, obviously.
The Leopard?
The Leopard of Giuseppe de Lampedusa. Yeah.
Okay.
She's definitely right on that one. Life and Fate is
I'm learning so much today. Yes.
Life and Fate is an extraordinary book, mainly about. Well, Grossman was obviously Jewish himself, but he saw almost everything that he could have done in the Second World War. He saw Stalingrad, and he was a journalist, and he wrote first-hand accounts of Stalingrad. He was also the first journalist into Treblinka, and his account, which you can read in one of the collections of his journalism, his account of walking into Treblinka is just one of the most devastating, haunting pieces of journalism or prose you can read. Anyhow, I mentioned him because Grossman in the middle of Life and Fate, which is about sort of 900-page novel, in the middle of it, which is about the dark axis around Stalingrad, where at one point he amazingly sort of goes into the minds of both Hitler and Stalin. He says Stalin in his study feels his counterpart in Berlin, and he says he feels very close to him at this moment.
Wow. Yeah. Around Stalingrad, like leading up to the battle.
After Stalingrad, when the Germans had lost, he says he feels the closeness of Hitler. But Grossman, in the middle of Life and Fate, slap bang at the worst hours of the 20th century, suddenly dedicates a chapter to anti-Semitism. And I've seen anti-Semitism as something I've always been very interested in, because I've always had an instinctive utter revulsion of it. And also partly because of having seen bits of it in the Middle East and elsewhere. But I mention this because Grossman, in the middle of Life and Fate, takes time out and does this like 3-page explanation, or 3-page description of anti-Semitism. And it's extraordinary. I mean, it's the only thing I can think of that's equally good is Gregor von Retzory, who wrote a luridly titled but brilliant set of novellas called The Confessions of an Anti-Semite, and about pre-First World War anti-Semitism in Eastern and Central Europe. Anyway, Grossman says in the middle of Life and Fate that one of the extraordinary things about anti-Semitism is that it does everything at the same time. That the Jews get condemned in one place for being rich and in another for being poor. Condemned in one place for assimilating and in another for not assimilating. For assimilating too much and assimilating too little. For being too successful, for not being successful enough. So I think it's the only racism that includes within it a detestation, for the real anti-Semite, a detestation of people that the person may perceive to be better than them, correctly or otherwise.
By the way, I'm embarrassed to say I have not read this one of two greatest novels of the 20th century, Life and Fate, Жизнь и судьба. And just to read off of Wikipedia, Vasily Grossman, a Ukrainian Jew, became a correspondent for the Soviet military paper Krasnaya Zvezda. Having volunteered and been rejected for military service, he spent 1,000 days in the front lines, roughly 3 of the 4 years of the conflict between the Germans and the Soviets. And the main themes covered in how's it go? Life and Fate. I keep thinking Жизнь и судьба is a theme on Jewish identity and the Holocaust, Grossman's idea of humanity and the human goodness, Stalin's distortion of reality and values, and Science, Life Goes On, and Reality of War. It's interesting. I need to definitely
read it. I think you'll really get a lot from it. It's one of the other things. Sorry, one reference, but one of the other things he does is that he has this extraordinary ability to talk about the absolute highest levels of the conflict and then zoom in. It's rather like the camera work they use in things like Lord of the Rings, where he zooms down and gets one person in the midst of all this, and you get on that.
What puts you in the study too. So I personally have read and reread the William Shire's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, who's another journalist who was there. But he does not do it. Interestingly enough, given such a large novel, kind of the definitive work on the definitive original work that goes to source materials on Hitler, he doesn't touch anti-Semitism really.
So, big thing to miss out.
Well, he just says it very calmly and objectively, as he does for most of the work, that this was the fact of life. There's a lot of cruelty throughout, but he doesn't get to.
Well, one of the things is, of course, they lost the war because of anti-Semitism. I mean, that's one quite important way to view it. This, how Andrew Roberts and other historians say it, is that, in the end, the Nazis lost the war because they were Nazis. It sounds almost too neat, but it's worth remembering that, at the end of the war, when the Germans need to be transporting troops and they need to be transporting very basic supplies, Eichmann makes sure he gets the trains to transport the Jews right up to the end.
Well, that's certainly a dark possibility.
But anyhow, but to go back to racism in general,
yes.
Racism in general, apart from anti-Semitism, relies on the perception that another group of people, a racial group other than your own, are inferior to you. That's what I'd say is the easiest shorthand of racism. And of course, it's one of the stupidest things that our species is capable of. I mean, one of the stupidest, that you can look at a person and guess them in their entirety, in fact, because of their skin color. I mean, it's like, what a stupid idea that is, as well as being an evil one. But the I would say that I think it's a dangerous thing in our era that there are bits of it coming back. That's why I say we do need we need our antennae working. We just don't need them to be overactive or underactive,
Now, the book is War in the West, but speaking of racism towards different groups based on their skin color, you've said that there's a war on white people in the U.S. Would you say that's the case? Would you say that there is significant racism towards white people in the United States?
I'd say that white people in the United States are the only people who are told that they have hereditary sin. And that's a big one, just to start with.
Based strictly on
their skin color. I mean, I would find it so repugnant and I hope everybody would join me in feeling this, I would feel it so repugnant if there were any school of thought in America today that had any grasp on the public attention that said that black people were born into evil because of something their ancestors had done. Like they had the mark of Cain upon them. I mean, I think it would be such a vicious way to try to demoralize a group of people and to tell them that the things they would be able to achieve in their lives are much lessened because they should spend significant portions of their lives trying to atone for something they didn't do.
Is there a difference?
And the following point, the obvious point left unsaid, but let's say it. nobody in the public square says that. I mean, they're the maniacs at the far fringes, but nobody in the mainstream would dare to say that, or I think even think that about any group of people other than white people. And does this mean that white people are more disadvantaged than black people? No. And again, let's not make this a competition, but let's not get into, I just desperately urge people not to get into the idea of hereditary sin according to racial background.
Is there something to be said about the feature aspect, to sort of play devil's advocate, about the asymmetry of sort of accusations towards the majority? So,
yes,
because
of
white,
course.
so
much easier to attack a majority.
It is much easier, but is there something to be said about that being a useful function of society, that you always attack, that the minority has disproportionate power to attack the majority so that you can always keep the majority in check?
Well, it's a dangerous game to play, isn't it?
I think
it's a very dangerous game to play.
I think that's a good summary of entirety of human civilization.
Well, yeah, everything's dangerous. But it's a very dangerous game to play that. I wrote about this a bit in The Madness of Crowds when I was saying, like, gay rights people, the ones that still exist, the ones who don't have homes to go to, who want to beat up on straight people in a way, or want to make straight people feel like they're kind of unremarkable, uncool, boring straights. So boring. So not like the magical pixie fairy dust gays. That's a bad idea to push that one. That's a bad idea. And some gays push that. Highly unwise. Given the fact that about 2 to 3% of the population are actually gay, although now there's like an additional 20% who think they're like two-spirit or something and all that bullshit, but they're just attention seekers, so let's not spend too much time on that. But equally, as I said in The Madness of Crowds with the feminist movement, very unwise for half of the species to say that the other half of the species isn't needed. And there were always third and fourth wave feminists willing to make that nuts argument. Not first wave feminists. You didn't hear it in first wave feminists. You didn't hear suffragettes tended not to say, we like the vote and men are scum. It would have been hard to have won everyone over to their side, not least the men they needed to win over to their side. But you do get third and fourth wave feminists who say, like, do we need men? Or men are all X. Again, it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea tactically.
What if men, Richard Wrangham, somebody from Harvard, describes that men are the originators of violence, physical violence in society. And he argues that actually the world would be better off. No, just a very cold calculus. If you get rid of men, there would be a lot less violence in society, is his claim.
But who says you need to get rid of violence in society?
Well, but shouldn't that at least be a discussion?
Well, I'm very happy
pros
to have
and
the
cons.
discussion.
Have a debate on a panel discussion, violence, pros and cons.
Well, that's the sort of thing, if I can say so, that some like weak-ass academic decides to do because he thinks that his area of Boston would be nicer or whatever. He might decide it's useful if he was living in Kiev today to have violent men. I mean, it might, if New York was invaded right now, I'd need some violent men around here.
But it wouldn't be invaded if there's no violent men.
Well,
that's goes the argument.
There's also, at least there's some level of threat that you ought to exude that puts people off. If I was in, I'm very glad that the men and women of Ukraine are capable of, and more than capable of, fighting for their country and for their neighbors and their families and much more. But it's better that there was violence ready to unleash when violence was unleashed upon them than that the whole society had been told that they should identify as non-binary.
But at least it's a conversation to have, isn't there? Isn't there aspect to the sort of the feminist movement that is correct in challenging the
some forms of violence, domestic violence, for instance, Although women are capable of that as well.
I'm learning about this.
We're all learning about this at the moment.
I can't help but watch the entirety of it go down in this beautiful mess that is human relations. Okay.
But just to finish that thought, I mean, it's very unwise for women to war against men, as it would be for men to war against women. It's highly, highly unwise to war on a majority population. And in America, Britain, and other Western countries, white people are still a majority. And so why would you tell the majority that they're evil by dint of their skin color and think that that would be a good way to keep them in check? I mean, I'm not guilty of anything because of my skin color. I'm not guilty of anything. My ancestors didn't do anything wrong. And even if they had, why would I be held responsible for it?
So to go back to Nietzsche, is there some aspect to where, if we try to explain the forces at play here, is it the will to power playing itself out from individual human nature and from group behavior nature? Is there some elements to this, which is the game we play as human beings, is always when we have less power, we try to find ways to gain more power?
That's certainly one. The desire to grab is, let me see if I can find a quote for you on that. The desire to grab that which we think we're owed, and to do it often in the guise of justice. I mean, justice is one of the great terms of our age, and one of the great bogus terms of our age. People forever talk about their search for justice, and it's amazing how violent they can often be in their search for justice, and how many rules they're willing to break so long as they can say they're after justice, and how many norms they can trample so long as they can say it's in the name of justice. You can burn down buildings in the name of justice.
Well, the majority groups throughout history, including those with white skin color, have done the same in the name of justice. We come up with all kinds of sexy terms in our propaganda machines to sell whatever atrocities we'd like to commit.
One of the quotes of from Nietzsche that I liked, and I quoted in this.
Careful, I'm judging you harshly.
Yeah, of course. Nietzsche says that one of the dangers of men of resentment is that they'll achieve their ultimate form of revenge, which is to turn happy people into unhappy people like themselves, to shove their misery in the faces of the happy, so that in due course the happy, and this is quoting Nietzsche, start to be ashamed of their happiness, and perhaps say to one another, it's a disgrace to be happy, there is too much misery. This is something to be averted, for the sick, says Nietzsche, must not make the healthy sick too, or make the healthy confuse themselves with the sick. Well, I think there again, there's a lot of that going on. How could I be happy when there is unhappiness in the world? Why should I not join the ranks of the unhappy?
I think Dostoevsky has a book about that as well.
Sure.
Notes from Underground.